I was 32 years old when I realized that love, in my family, was conditional, measured not by affection, but by achievement. My name is Audrey Thompson, and for most of my life, I was the quiet one, the girl who colored inside the lines, who smiled when others took credit, who learned to swallow disappointment so gracefully it became second nature. Growing up in the Thompson household meant living under a microscope of comparison. My father, a financial advisor with an obsession for success, treated life like a balance sheet. Every moment was a transaction. My mother, Ever, the social butterfly, saw her children as reflections of her reputation. And then there was my older brother, Evan, the prodigy, the one who made them proud. Evan was the sun, and I was the shadow that followed. When I got an A, he got an award. When I painted, he won scholarships. When I designed my first dress at 16 and won a local art competition, my father said, "That's nice, but you know creativity won't pay the bills." Right. Evan had just secured a university research grant. The timing was perfect for them. Painful for me. My family's dinners were performances of success metrics. My father would talk about the stock market. Evan would discuss his new projects. And my mother would interject with which social circle she'd impressed that week. I learned to nod, to smile, to disappear politely when the conversation turned toward real achievements. But behind closed doors, I built a world of my own. My room was my sanctuary, a small, cluttered universe of sketches, fabric swatches, and design mock-ups taped to every wall. Late at night, while the rest of the house slept, I'd sit under a dim lamp, sketching dresses that told stories no one in my family wanted to hear. When I turned 25, I moved to the city. I left without a dramatic goodbye, without begging for understanding. I just packed my bags, left a note that said, "I need to try," and boarded a train that smelled faintly of diesel and new beginnings. The city didn't greet me with open arms, it tested me. I slept on a futon for months, ate instant noodles more often than I'd admit, and sent out design portfolios that were mostly ignored. Every rejection letter stung, but it also sharpened something in me. I worked part-time in a floral shop to pay rent, and every evening, I designed. Then, one day, everything changed. A boutique owner, Marina, saw one of my sketches pinned to the floral shop's bulletin board. "Who drew this?" she asked, holding the paper between her manicured fingers. "I did," I said, my voice trembling. She looked at me for a moment, then said, "Come by my studio tomorrow. I think you have something." That was the start of everything. For the next few years, I worked for Marina's boutique, learning not just fashion, but life. She taught me how to negotiate, how to trust my instincts, how to stop apologizing for existing. She was the mother figure I never had, tough but kind, demanding but fair. By 30, I was leading my own design label A.T. Atelier. I poured every ounce of my soul into it. My collections were small but meaningful, each piece handmade, each detail deliberate. Critics began to notice. Awards followed. And then, one day, the email that changed everything arrived. "Congratulations, Audrey Thompson. You've been nominated for the Apex Award for Innovative Design." The Apex Award was the pinnacle of recognition in our industry. My hands shook as I reread the email over and over. For once, I wanted to share the news not for validation, but for the simple human joy of saying, "Look, I did it." So I called home. Mom answered. "Audrey, darling, it's been ages." I smiled. "I have news. I was nominated for the Apex Award. It's a big honor, it means." She cut me off. "Oh, that's wonderful. But listen, your father and I just booked our trip to Greece with Evan and his wife. It's the same weekend as your thing. Right. We can't change the flights now. You'll have to send us photos. I froze. You're not coming. Honey, she said, with that soft tone people use when they're sure they're being reasonable. You know how expensive these trips are. Besides, you'll be fine. You've always been so independent. Independent. The word landed like a slap disguised as a compliment. After she hung up, I sat there in my studio surrounded by unfinished gowns and silence. For years, I'd convinced myself that one day they'd notice me, not because they had to, but because they'd want to. That day would be the proof that all the nights I cried in secret hadn't been wasted. But it wasn't coming. So, I went to the apex ceremony alone. The event was dazzling crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, red carpets filled with people whose names I'd once whispered like prayers. When they called my name as the winner, the room erupted in applause. My heart raced. My vision blurred with tears as I stepped onto the stage. And yet, as I held the award, a hollow ache expanded inside me. There were no familiar faces in the crowd, no one to meet my eyes and say, I knew you could do it. After the ceremony, I walked outside, the cold night air wrapping around me like both comfort and punishment. I sat on the edge of the fountain, clutching the golden trophy against my chest. When an elderly man approached, he had silver hair, a navy coat, and eyes that held the kind of sadness that only comes from knowing life too well. Congratulations, he said softly, nodding toward the award. Thank you, I whispered, forcing a smile. He looked at me for a moment, then asked, Tell me, does it feel the way you thought it would? He blinked. What do you mean? That recognition you've been chasing, he said. Does it feel like enough? The question hit harder than I expected. I looked down at the trophy. Its polished surface, reflecting my face smiling. But tired. I thought it would. I said, but it doesn't. He nodded knowingly. It never does. If you're trying to fill a void someone else created. I didn't know what to say. He smiled gently, reaching into his pocket. My name's Harold Wilson. I used to design for Lemaire Studios before I retired. I see a lot of myself in you too much. Maybe. Here. He handed me something small, a brass key. Worn but beautifully crafted. This opens a studio on 5th Street. It's been closed for years. I think it's time someone new used it. I stared at him, speechless. I can't accept this. You can, he said with quiet conviction, because I can see that you're standing on the edge of something greater. And this, he gestured to the key. This is your beginning, not your validation. He smiled once more before walking away, his silhouette fading into the night. I sat there for a long time, the key glinting in my palm. A stranger had seen more in me in 10 minutes than my family had in 32 years. That night, I went home, placed the trophy on the shelf, and laid the key beside it. The trophy felt like closure. The key felt like possibility. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my studio floor, catching on the edges of fabric rolls and unfinished sketches. The brass key lay on my desk, glinting faintly, as if it carried its own quiet heartbeat. I kept staring at it, wondering if the entire conversation with Harold Wilson had been some kind of surreal dream. But it was real. The key was real. Solid. Warm to the touch. I spent the morning pacing. Every rational part of me whispered that this was crazy. You don't just walk into a stranger's studio because of a sentimental moment under the stars. But something inside me, something that had been asleep for years, stirred. It wasn't curiosity. It was instinct. By noon, I found myself standing in front of a faded brick building on 5th Street. The city hummed around me, alive and indifferent. The studio was on the 2nd floor, the number 203 barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint. The lock was old, almost ornamental, like something from another time. I hesitated before sliding the key in, It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting. The door creaked open. Inside was dust and memory. Sheets covered old drafting tables. Rolls of fabric leaned against the walls like forgotten sentinels. The air smelled of wood, time, and something faintly sweet lavender. Maybe. In the far corner stood a large mannequin draped in an unfinished gown, yellowed with age, and beside it, pinned to the wall, was a photograph of a young Harold Wilson beaming, alive, surrounded by sketches. I ran my fingers over the photo, feeling a strange wave of tenderness. "You left this for me," I whispered. I spent the entire day there. I opened every drawer, studied every tool, every note scrawled in faded ink. It was like stepping into someone's creative mind, a legacy preserved in dust. And somewhere between organizing old sketches and sweeping the floor, I began to feel at peace, not the fleeting kind that comes from escape, but the grounded peace of purpose. I decided to restore the studio. Days turned into weeks. I scrubbed, repaired, painted, and redesigned the space until it began to breathe again. The moment I turned on the lights after the final coat of paint dried, I felt something shift deep within me. I wasn't just fixing a room, I was reclaiming my voice. News of the studio spread fast. Within months, young designers and artists began reaching out, curious about the newly reopened Wilson Atelier. I started hosting open design nights, where anyone, students, hobbyists, dreamers could come work, sketch, share ideas. What began as one person's refuge turned into a creative haven. We called ourselves the Collective. Every week, the room filled with laughter, the hum of sewing machines, the soft scratch of pencils on paper. I taught them what I had learned the hard way, that art doesn't need permission, and validation isn't love. Watching them grow healed me in ways I didn't expect. But then, as life does, it circled back. One morning, as I was reviewing some sketches, my assistant burst into the room. "Audrey, you've got to see this." She handed me her phone. My brother, Evan, was on the local news. Apparently, his company had been caught in a massive fraud scandal involving misused research funds. The footage showed him escorted from his office, head lowered, cameras flashing. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, just an odd sense of symmetry. Life had its own ways of balancing the scales. Later that week, my mother called for the first time in over a year. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice fragile, "you've probably seen the news. Evan's going through a terrible time. We were hoping you might talk to him. You've always been the strong one." I almost laughed. The strong one. The invisible one. The one they hadn't bothered to stand beside when I needed them. "Mom," I said quietly, "I'm not the person who fixes things for everyone anymore." There was silence. "I know we weren't there for you," she whispered. "But please, Audrey, family sticks together." My chest tightened. Did family stick together when you missed my award ceremony? When you didn't even ask how I was doing for years? She didn't answer. "Finally," I said, "I hope Evan finds his way." But I already did, and I did it alone. After I hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring out the studio window at the skyline. The sunlight hit the city like gold, warm and defiant. I thought about Harold Wilson, about how he had given me more than a key. He'd given me permission to stop waiting for the people who never came. That evening, I hosted another collective session. The room was alive with energy. Among the new faces was a shy girl named Leah, maybe 19, clutching a worn sketchbook. She hovered near the door until I called her over. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she said softly. "My family says I'm wasting my time with this." I smiled gently. "You're talking to the wrong person if you're looking for permission to quit." She blinked, then smiled back. I handed her a small brass key that I'd had made after finding Harold's original design in an old drawer. "What's this?" she asked. "It's your invitation," I said, to create without apology. As she walked to her station, I realized the circle was complete. The following week, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from Harold Wilson's daughter. My father always believed in the power of passing the torch. Before he died, he asked me to find out what became of the woman he gave his studio key to. I think he knew what you would turn it into. Thank you for giving his dream new life. I cried when I read it. Not because it hurt, but because it healed. Life had finally come full circle from being the girl who wasn't enough to becoming the woman who created enough for others to believe in themselves. One evening, as I locked up the studio, I stood by the window, the city glowing below. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Harold." And maybe, just maybe, I heard the faintest whisper back a breeze that brushed against the glass, carrying the scent of lavender. A few months later, the collective had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. What started as a few dreamers meeting in an old studio had become a full-fledged movement. We hosted workshops, charity auctions, and mentorship programs. Students who once doubted their worth were now winning grants, launching their own lines, and teaching others. The walls of that studio, once silent and dust-covered, now echoed with music, laughter, and the sound of sewing machines humming in rhythm with possibility. I'd never felt more fulfilled. Yet, there was still one wound that hadn't closed my family. My parents hadn't reached out again after my conversation with my mother. And honestly, I thought I'd made peace with it. But healing has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it. One Friday evening, I received a letter, not an email, not a message, but a real letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting familiar in its neat precision. Evan. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, the first line read, "I used to think winning was everything. I finally understand how wrong I was." He went on to explain everything: the investigation, the shame, the emptiness he'd carried since our parents' attention had turned cold after his scandal. He wrote that he had always known they favored him, but he hadn't realized how deeply it had hurt me until he lost everything they'd given him. "I used to think you were the lucky one, the one who didn't have to carry their expectations. But now I see you carried something heavier: their indifference. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small to make myself feel big." When I finished reading, I sat there for a long time, tear tracing quiet lines down my cheeks. It wasn't redemption. Not completely. But it was something I never thought I'd receive acknowledgement. A week later, I met him for coffee. He looked older, worn, stripped of the arrogance he used to wear like armor. When he saw me, he stood, awkward but sincere. "Audrey," he said quietly, "you look good." "Thank you," I replied. "You don't." He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair enough." We sat, and for the first time in our adult lives, we talked not about achievements, not about who was better, but about everything in between. He told me he was starting over, teaching part-time, volunteering with youth programs. He wanted to build something honest this time. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I hope we can start again." I took a deep breath. "You don't need forgiveness," I said. "You just need to be different. That's enough." When we parted, there was no grand reconciliation, just a quiet understanding, and that was enough too. Months later, I got an unexpected visitor at the studio. My mother. She looked smaller somehow, her polished exterior cracked by time and regret. "It took me a long time to find the courage to come," she said, standing in the doorway, clutching her handbag like a shield. "I didn't speak. I saw your feature in Modern Vision magazine," she continued. "Your studio is breathtaking. I wish I could have been proud of you sooner." Her voice wavered, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as the perfectionist mother who demanded I be someone else, but as a woman who was afraid of her own inadequacy. I gestured toward the old wooden stool by the window. Sit. She did. Her eyes moved around the studio, landing on a large framed photo on the wall, me and the collective, standing beneath the sign that read, "Create without permission." She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "You built something beautiful, Audrey." "I built what I needed," I said quietly, "and what others needed too." Tears filled her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you by pushing you to be practical. I see now I was just afraid of you becoming what I could never be." Her honesty disarmed me. For the first time, I didn't see her as my critic. I saw her as human, flawed, frightened, but trying. I walked to my desk and opened a small drawer. Inside was another brass key, one of the extras I had made for new collective members. I turned it over in my hand, then held it out to her. She looked at me, confused. "What's this?" "It's a key," I said simply. "It doesn't open a door here. It's just a reminder. You don't have to stay locked inside your guilt." She took it slowly, her fingers trembling. Then she smiled, a real, trembling smile that carried both sorrow and gratitude. "I'd like to come see your next show," she said softly. "I'd like that," I replied, and she did. Months later, when the collective showcased its biggest exhibition, yet the threads that bind us, my mother sat in the front row. So did Evan. They didn't clap the loudest, but their presence said more than applause ever could. After the show, I stood backstage, watching the young artists soak in their moment of recognition. I thought about Harold Wilson again, the man who had given me a key that led to everything I had now. He'd passed the torch without knowing how far it would burn. I'd carried it forward. Now it was time for others to do the same. The following year, I launched the Key Initiative, a mentorship program providing free creative resources for underprivileged youth. Every participant received a brass key engraved with a simple message, "You already belong." When the program aired on national television, I received an email from a journalist asking what inspired it. I wrote back, "A stranger once gave me a key that opened more than a door. It opened my life. I'm just passing it on." That night, I sat alone in the studio. Lights dimmed, the city glowing beyond the windows. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the original brass key Harold had given me. The metal had dulled over time, but it was still strong, still warm from my touch. I whispered, "You were right. It wasn't validation, it was beginning." The wind outside rattled softly against the window pane, almost like applause. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd made it. I already knew. If you've ever felt unseen, unloved, or overlooked, please remember the family you build from truth will always be stronger than the one that tried to silence you. Keep going. Your key is waiting. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of their worth. And subscribe for more stories of resilience, courage, and rebirth. Tell me in the comments, what door are you ready to open next?